Right, we are back, and I have a guest. We have Kat Sale from House of Performance. Kat, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Would you like to tell everyone your background, a bit about your business, and how you came to where you are today?
Crikey. Yeah, okay. So I've worked in performance marketing for about 15 years, specifically PPC, paid social display. Um, Worked for a couple of different agencies and then set up House Performance with my co-founder in early 2021. We specialize in consultancy, helping brands basically get more out of different platforms that they're using and or get more out of the teams that they're using to run campaigns. And we also kind of manage campaigns for businesses as well. So we do a variety of work for really any business in any industry. We don't have a specialist industry. Um, just depends on what people need in terms of like improving their performance and gaining trust in their team and campaigns. Um, yeah, that's about it. I don't know what else to
About
say.
now, I'm sure there's more to it. We'll get into that. But for the next half an hour or so, we're going to be talking about the idea of managing budget constraints, especially in uncertain times. We won't get into detail, but we know probably the last 3 years, I'd like to say, it's been tough. You've had pandemics, we've had cost of living crises, we've had you name it, we've had it, and the impact on marketing has been big. It's caused issues from a budget perspective, especially agency owners like ourselves. Working with clients who have shrinking marketing budgets. So I'm here today to get your insight, Kat, really on what your thoughts and feelings are on that. So, question number one. So, when things do get uncertain economically, um, obviously we know marketing budgets can take a hit. So, what advice can you share with other marketing leaders, brand leaders, etc., to help make them a sort of compelling case to maintain or even increase a budget in those times? Because I do think we're the case to do that.
Yeah, it's such a complicated one, isn't it? Because it depends on the business situation. I mean, we had a client recently whose the business was at a critical point where it was like if they don't focus solely on profit driving activity only and really pull back, the business could go
Right.
under. But that the marketing leader there made a really good case internally to keep certain things switched on. I'll talk about what in a minute. Um, because if they didn't keep certain things on, they literally would not have any sales, and that would be the end of it. So I think a lot of it comes down to the relationship that you as a marketing leader might have with the CFO, and if you can get them to obviously see the importance of whatever marketing is driving the sales, that's number one, right? Because if they can't clearly see that, you've got no chance really, and your
Is that by
budgets will be
presenting
cut.
data, historical data, do you think?
Yeah, and I think some of it's about not waiting for that point where the budget's going to be cut. It's actually about always having a foundation of knowing the board, particularly the CFO, knowing what is driving what
Absolutely. Yeah.
essentially. And because if say you've got a business that's performing quite well at the moment, but you know that potentially, I don't know, for whatever reason, winter's a difficult time, thinking ahead to that, now's the time to start talking to the CFO about, okay, well, this is driving blah blah, and we're doing this here, and maybe this area is not driving as much, so we're going to look to move budget, like basically preempting it, and then having that open dialogue about it. Does
No.
that make
Yeah, no,
sense?
absolutely. Do you think that do you think there's a case to increase budgets in times like this? Do you see it as an opportunity, or do you see it as a time to protect yourself more, or is it dependent?
It's totally dependent on the business, I think. I mean, it depends what you sell, doesn't
No,
it?
of course, yeah.
If you sell something that is useful to people in time of economic crisis, why would you pull back?
So the fake,
It's a bit like if you think about when COVID hit, if you were one of the lucky people that sold hand sanitizer,
yeah,
you would not have pulled back, would you? Even though most businesses were pulling back initially on their marketing.
yeah. If you sell face
So I
masks,
think
you're
just
you're
yeah,
you're laughing,
yeah,
aren't you? I suppose.
Yeah, and like so, if you think about the cost of living crisis, obviously the news on that has calmed down a bit because we're in summer, but actually come September, October, when people start thinking about their heating, that's going to come back. It's not gone away. If you sell something to do with energy saving, and that could be anything, that could be like renewable energy, or it could be that you sell blankets. It sounds really obvious, but like something that can reduce you having to put the heating on. Why would you pull back, in that time? You wouldn't, would you? Well,
No,
logically you
not
wouldn't.
logically, no.
So I think, yeah, you've just got to try and think about it in that way.
No, absolutely. And I suppose with any marketing budget, there's always those sort of luxury things in there, isn't there? That maybe don't drive quite as much value as the other things, but they're in there because maybe they've always been in there, or it's sort of a nice to have. Would you recommend
Mm.
identifying those bits and pieces and taking them out, or would you carry on with those?
I always question everything that's running. So even if times are good, to me, that whoever's leading the marketing front should be questioning what is the value of every single bit. So I don't think it's okay to say, oh, well, that's always been like that. That's always been there. We always run that. I think that every campaign, every platform that you're running should be questioned to make sure it's justifying itself for the role it's meant to play.
Lead
So,
generation.
yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a whole conversation about upper and lower funnel, which we can talk about, but like if whatever the campaign's goal is, if it is not hitting it and can't be seen to get there with a roadmap, then yeah, pull it back. But that doesn't mean you have to not spend that money. It means that you could put that into
No,
something
it makes
else.
sense. I think certainly one of the questions I was having, especially during a time where people were really, really thinking about their marketing budget, was it's sort of two ways, and I think you kind of touched on it there, that sort of upper and lower side of the funnel. One's very, very direct, one's very, very 50-50. Put money
Mm,
in, get leads or sales out. The other part of that is very much about awareness. It's a bit more, it's more difficult to attribute success to it effectively, but we do know it works. Obviously, we
yeah,
know it works. Us as marketers, we know it works because we've done it over a period of years, but it's not quite as quick to show success. And that's quite difficult, I think,
yeah.
to convince different stakeholders to do that.
That is the
So,
hardest
what's
part
your thoughts
by
on
far.
that? Is there a way to attribute success to those longer term channels, or
So with clients, what we'll often do is we'll talk about like each campaign as where it is in the funnel. This is not new to anyone, I guess, but like if something's completely upper funnel, we might talk about it as stage one, and the KPI of stage one is not going to be a sale or a
no?
lead. It might be stage one might be the goal is to get a user to stage
Yeah,
two. So say you're doing some prospecting on Facebook to cold audiences. The goal of that campaign might simply be to get people to follow the page or to go to the website because then you can remarket to them, which is really cheap. So just trying to get so thinking about it in that way, but then also trying to get the senior stakeholders who might have influence on the budget, get them to think about it that way and understand that.
no, it makes sense. I quite like that actually, in terms
Mm,
of the KPI being simply just moving one step closer to the end of the funnel. That's something that's
yeah.
worked well for you when talking with different stakeholders.
Definitely. Like we had a client, they do like financial trading business, and we were running lots of activity, upper and lower funnel. Every week we'd get questions, why are you spending all this stuff on upper funnel? What's it doing? As soon as we moved to like stage one, two, three, basically, as a way of categorizing campaigns, and we were militant with it, like to the point where we'd physically rename the campaign what stage it is in, because then it's like in people's
Yeah,
faces. You can then have reports by stages. As soon as we moved to that and started talking about that in line with the KPIs for each, it made such a
no, I can
difference.
imagine.
Made it much
I think a
easier.
lot of convincing stakeholders to do different things with budgets is about making it as easy to understand as possible, making it as black and white as possible,
Yeah,
and brand
yeah,
awareness, early stages in the funnel. It's never black and white, but clearly you've managed to make it black and white, which I think is great. And yeah, I might be
yeah.
stealing that one.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean we never drop the budget on
No,
stage one when it's tight, but it just means that we can have a clearer conversation
no,
about it, which makes it easier.
absolutely, yeah. And there is
Yeah,
times where generating the extra leads or the extra sales is arguably more valuable than a little bit more brand awareness. I wouldn't ever say that for a,
definitely.
a brand designer or somebody who's But obviously,
Yeah.
you, as a performance marketer yourself, Kat, you'll know that it's super important to put figures on the board in terms of revenue and sales. So
Yeah.
sometimes you have to prioritize that.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
your experience, working in your career, is there any sort of channels or platforms that lend itself to smaller budgets or even offer a bit more flexibility in sort of tough times?
Yeah. I mean, so we really mainly work with Google, Meta ads, TikTok, LinkedIn, all of which are very flexible in the way budgets can be set daily and can change. And, there's not too strict a minimum, although I'll talk about that in a minute. They all have their place for different businesses. I would say 80% of businesses are going to get a higher ROI on Google search
Yeah,
generally, because obviously if a user is showing intent for something, if you can just give
of
it to
course.
them,
Yeah,
why wouldn't you get that sale or the lead, whatever? But I have definitely seen more and more businesses where actually they get a higher ROI on paid social than Google, which I think is really interesting. And I think there's definitely something about if what you're selling isn't necessarily price competitive and you need a platform that you can showcase what it is, actually paid social is a better way to go than
it's a lot more
Google.
visual, isn't it?
It's a lot more visual. You can do videos, you can explain it. Whereas on Google, price is so
Of course.
important.
Do you think that has a budget
If you,
impact in terms of needing the assets, needing the media, needing that?
I mean, yeah, that is a thing. But then I would say it's getting much more easy to like make
It
your own
is.
creative
Yeah,
almost. We've worked with clients that literally just use their own iPhone to make their own
yeah.
TikToks, and they're really
As I say,
good.
go occasionally.
So
Yeah. No, it makes
yeah.
sense. Makes sense totally. And how are you sort of showing ROI to your customers in terms of using that to entice them to potentially increase their budget? Are you showing low level figures, or are you really going into the weeds of how the campaigns are performing and what stage they're at?
So we generally, when we report, we start at top level how things are doing, but then the report will contain deeper stuff further down, and people can read that if they want.
And
Does
does
that
that
make
have
sense?
justifications for increasing the budget? Yeah.
Decisions. Yeah, exactly. So it might be, okay, this or this platform or this campaign has driven a lot more, so we recommend increasing here. If your total budget can't go up, we could move from here,
So to distribute the budget between
Uh,
different channels and different platforms.
yeah, yeah. And then if it gets to a point, say a client's budget's really been squeezed, if it gets to a point where one channel is really outperforming, it might be that we say, actually, you don't have the budget to
Just
run on two
all
or
over
three
there, yeah.
platforms. You've got to focus. The classic example I see is where a client, if their budget's got to be cut, they just like halve all the budgets on all the campaigns evenly, and then they're spread so thin they can't really do anything, and that's just basically pointless in my
So your
opinion.
your your
They
approach
should
to that is
just
to take a
focus.
step back, reevaluate, and if it has been halved, it doesn't mean you should halve it globally.
Not flat,
It means
no
actually you
way.
should probably, if you're managing 5 channels, maybe focus on 2 out of the 5, whatever it might be.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
makes
Exactly. Or even if, and even if you say you've only got one, say you're only running on Google, it might be that there's campaigns within that that you
yeah.
just don't or can't afford at the moment or don't need, or you could maybe like I mean, this is what I love about performance marketing. You can cut a campaign down to really focus if you need to. So like, I don't know, say you're running in the whole of the UK and your budget gets halved. It could be that instead of like cutting scope, it could be that you just reduce the locations you're
Right.
advertising in. So you can still be aggressive where you want to be, but not
Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah. Just pick your battles, so to speak. Makes
Yeah.
sense. Just going back to the channel discussion we were having previous to that. What's your thoughts on Bing?
I think Bing's really
It's
useful
cheap.
and
In
always
my experience, it's a
overlooked.
lot cheaper. There's
Yeah.
often, well, I'm not sure if this is fact or not, but I've definitely read it somewhere, and it's definitely come true for a lot of the things I've worked on in the past. Is there's a certain type of demographic that uses Bing, and it's typically business people, maybe higher net
Yeah.
worth.
Yeah. And it's less competitive, a lot less competitive. I think it's grown quite a bit since they launched
AI,
ChatGPT or
yes,
took
no,
it
of
over.
course.
So I think it's a really good place to look. It's really easy to use now because you can literally import from Google, and you can have a daily import that just updates with your changes from Google. Obviously, there's some differences, like there's no Performance Max and stuff, but I think, yeah, it should definitely be considered in the mix. It's high intent. I probably wouldn't advertise just on there with a client unless their budgets were really constrained, because it is small. But it's definitely worth thinking about, yeah.
And you mentioned there about one of the things you see quite commonly is when someone halves their budgets or cut their budget, they just keep everything the same, but they just scale it down. And that's
Yeah.
obviously
It's
a
just
massive,
lazy.
a
Yeah.
massive pitfall. Are there anything else you see in terms of common mistakes when people are looking at lowering their budgets in your experience?
I think just like assuming that everything that was live needs to still be live. So like some people really feel that they need to be live on display as a campaign type, even if they can only give it like 50 quid a
Yeah,
day budget. And you sort of think, well, do you need to be live on it? Like, just really try and ask yourself the question, what do I actually need to do? Like, similarly with brand, like in search, we see a lot of advertisers spending quite a lot of money on their own brand name. Really question that, because if it's not that competitive with other people bidding on your brand, why are you paying for it? You don't have
mm.
to. You can pick up those sales organically, probably. We did quite an interesting test with a client when their budget got pulled back, where their brand name was highly competitive, like loads of people bidding on it all the time. So we always had an ad there, obviously, to protect it. But then, because the budget was constrained and the goal of the business is new customer acquisition, so not really a brand at all, because it's just bringing back people that probably already know you and would come back. So we did some analysis and actually pulled back the spend on desktop, not on mobile, because on mobile, when you do a search, there's only room for like 1.5 ad above the fold.
Yeah.
So if your competitor's there, you're probably going to miss out, because the user might not see you. Whereas on desktop, there's loads of space. They'll probably see your ad organically. And pulling back that way meant that they didn't have to compromise being on brand as much, but they saved quite a lot of the budget, which we can then put
Yeah, yeah,
elsewhere.
no, that's interesting. And how much were they putting into their brand, like in terms of percentage split?
Well, they're spending thousands on it a
Well,
month.
blimey.
I reckon it's
Yes, their
probably like
name.
30%. It's a name that's got the thing I can't say it, but it's a name that's got the thing they're selling
Right,
in it. So it's
got you.
really easy for other people to bid on it by mistake. I don't think there's lots of people bidding on it
No,
on purpose, if that makes sense. I mean, some of them definitely are, but yeah. But it's really frustrating to spend money on that, because you're not even acquiring new
yeah,
customers. You're just protecting current
no,
ones.
100%. No, I get it. In terms of, I'm going to ask you something now that I think, no, I don't think you'll struggle with it, but I think it might be difficult for you to appear unbiased on this, because as somebody who's obviously very keen on PPC, you know, when a marketing leader has a budget at their disposal, they are looking at all the channels. So they've got X amount over for SEO, X amount over PPC, a bit for social media, a bit for maybe some print or events, whatever it might be. What's your I suppose what's your sales pitch for keeping PPC? Because I've heard so many times it's such an easy thing to drop. PPC
Mm,
is because it's such a you can literally turn the
mm,
spend off with a click of a button. Whereas there's not many
yeah.
channels where you can do that, and it leaves
No.
businesses like us exposed a little bit in time. I suppose
Yeah,
what's
massively
your
so.
sales pitch for keeping PPC switched on? Is I suppose is the question.
I'd have to look at what that business is getting from it. How else would they get that?
Yeah,
Because they're not going to be at the top organically for everything. I doubt. Nobody is. So, if there's some really key terms that they wouldn't appear on that are driving sales, why would you miss out on
yeah.
those? But I'm not against people saying they need to pull back budget on PPC,
No, no, of
definitely,
course, yeah.
because you can so easily pull different levers to make the spend more efficient. So I actually quite like it when clients say, I want to spend a bit less. Not, I mean, realistically, because it's a challenge that can be met because there's so many levers to pull. Does
No,
that
that
make
makes
sense?
sense. There's this scope for you to
Um,
prove that it can work, rather than them from the outset
yeah,
saying nope, just cutting that, and it's all too
yeah,
easy to do that. As I say, the barrier for them cutting the budget is so low. Whereas something like
yeah.
I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but sometimes there's contracts in place, sometimes there's this, sometimes there's that, but literally click of a button, that
Yeah.
budget, you can save that money quite.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit like if you've got TV booked or something, obviously you can't just cancel it necessarily last minute. And I would also challenge them to look at what they're achieving in SEO, and are there ways that SEO and PPC could work together to spend a bit less on PPC. So, for example, if there's like 10 terms that they appear really highly on for SEO, for organically, maybe you don't need to be there in PPC for those, and you can cut the budget but not completely remove it, because you could use it to be there for the terms that you can't appear for
No,
organically.
it makes sense. My experience certainly is that SEO and PPC work best together, or work really,
Definitely.
really well together. You can dominate them SERPs, both paid and organically, and then
Yeah.
you're in a really strong position. Other
Yeah.
than the ones, I mean, you shared quite a few things today, but other than what you've already mentioned, are there any sort of out the box approaches that you've got that spring to mind that can help marketing leaders or bag holders, as I call them, to stretch their budgets and achieve some results that they want?
So, two things really. In if let's talk about Meta first. So, I think that an area that is totally overlooked on Meta is lookalike audiences.
Right.
So, if you can if you can leverage your own customer data, get it in the system, then you can make a lookalike audience of literally people that have the same browsing habits as your customers. It's really cheap to do. It's free to set that up, but then obviously it's quite cost effective because it's kind of your audience built out. Clients do not use that enough. So I think that's it's actually quite a simple strategy that
Yeah.
every business should
How
do
how
that.
accurate is that in terms of the what Facebook comes up with, or Meta?
Well, we can't tell how accurate it is, as in they don't tell us who's in the
No, no, of course.
audience, but the proof's in the performance. Like, it performs almost always nearly as well as remarketing, which I just think is incredible because they are new customers because they don't know you. So in that case, trust in the black box, which I never, like 5 years ago, I never would have said
Yeah,
that. Never, ever would have said
no,
that.
that's interesting.
But I really do now.
Any
Yeah.
any other sort of out of the box
And,
strategies?
well, the other one, which again is a bit black boxy, is Performance Max on Google,
Yes.
which people love to hate. And I have gone through phases of hating it. But in the last 6 months, I think the combination of advertisers learning how to actually use it properly, and Google's actually released a lot more features to
Mm,
it. Actually, performance on it for clients is phenomenal now. And we're using it not just for shopping clients for ecom, we're using it for all sorts. Like, we've seen in lead gen it work really well, which I never would have expected.
makes sense. Makes
Again, having a bit of trust in the black box solution. You put your constraints around it,
Yeah,
make sure you're controlling roughly what it's doing, but then just letting it go, giving it a boundary, target CPA or ROAS, and let it go.
100%. No, we've certainly.
And
It's
yeah,
been a bit love hate with us, to be fair, in terms of performance maps, but certainly growing
yeah,
to growing to become more of a fan of it nowadays.
yeah.
What's
I think they're really improving it, and I think it's good. What I would say is, don't test it with just like a small 30 quid a day budget, because you just can't get
no,
anywhere.
no,
I know you can technically put a very low budget in, but there's no
throw a
point.
bit of money at it, really test it. And
Yeah.
what's your thoughts on in terms of things to either stretch budgets or even stretch resource, because time is money at the end of the day. It's a bit of a swear word. But what's your thoughts on AI and how that's has that impacted you at all? Have you sort of come head to head with AI at all?
Um, I don't like to think of it as head to head. I like to think of it as an extra person that can help me.
I,
So we have started using it to kind of come up with keyword ideas, write ad copy, or not write it, come up with ad copy ideas, and then we take it. Um, I think it's great for that. I think it saves time, but I don't think it saves as much time yet as everyone thinks it does, if that
agree,
makes sense. Because you still got to go through it and make sure it's okay. Some stuff it comes out with is just crap.
100%. I think it certainly
Um,
can save time. The way it's going, I
yeah,
can see. use cases that I could
Yeah.
see in the future that we're not quite ready for yet, but definitely I can see it being very useful at a time where we are lacking resource, maybe lacking a bit of time. I want to get something done quicker than maybe we usually would.
Yeah.
There's an urgency around it, a campaign date, deadline, whatever it might be. I don't think we're
Yeah.
quite there yet. Keyword idea,
No.
ad copy ideas potentially,
Yeah.
scripts for media potentially. But
Yeah.
yeah, I know what you're saying. It's not. I think if you ask the client, they'd probably think, well, they're just using AI. Or it's not like that at
Yeah.
all. It's an,
No. Even, I mean, really, Performance Max is an
yeah,
AI driven campaign type, but we still use human intervention to manage
yeah, of
it
course.
and optimize it. And if you don't, well, if, we had a client recently where um, quite a big change happened on their site that affected the conversion rates, and we didn't update the targets on the campaign to reflect
Mm.
that. AI couldn't work it out. The performance tanked, and then it pulled us out of the auction, so we stopped spending. And it was only when we did our job basically, and we're like, no, we need to update
Good to
this,
hear.
that it started working again. So you can't just leave these things and set them up. You have to work with it.
No, I agree. Totally agree. I think AI certainly now it's going to need that human intervention, but there's small efficiencies to be made, definitely.
Definitely.
And talking of the wider marketing, not just focusing on paid today, clearly, but it's worked a lot for other areas of marketing. We're a bit more holistic in terms of looking at social and SEO and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. There's things I wouldn't recommend it for. Like I'd never recommend taking it from a copywriting point of view and just lumping it on our website. Definitely not. But again, structures,
No.
content structures, blog structures, all that kind of stuff can work really well.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see what comes from AI, if truth be told. Um,
Definitely.
are you sort of giving your customers or even yourself advice on longer term strategies? You mentioned it earlier in terms of we're in the summer now, so the news is a little bit quiet on the cost of living, but I can see clearly the way you're thinking is actually as soon as October hits, we're going to start hearing it again. So are you starting to lay the groundwork for that now, or
Yeah. Depending on the business
yeah?
and what they do, right, and what they
Uh-huh.
sell, always trying to think ideally 6 to 12 months
Right.
ahead,
Okay.
which everybody struggles with sometimes. So just really bringing it back to that when you're having strategy sessions, I'd say. Obviously, it depends what the business does and sells, but every business has peaks and troughs, right? It's a bit like we were halfway through the year last week, weren't we? I can't remember the date. The
Don't
21st,
tell
I
me that.
think. Well, that means we're halfway to Christmas.
Funny
How many businesses does that
It's funny you
affect?
say
Like
that.
most,
We and I
really.
had a little bit of jip on this internally, but our next webinar is all about preparing for Christmas. It's all about preparing for Black
Perfect.
Friday, and I truly believe that now is the time to be doing that.
Yeah. Black Friday's a funny one, isn't it? We had a situation with a client last year when they felt they needed to be in for it and enter the auctions and really compete on both Google and Meta, like just be everywhere for Black Friday. But it's so saturated that they lost so much
Yeah,
money. So their strategy is we don't do
don't
Black
do it.
Friday. They just don't do it. And actually, because they're not spending all that extra money, their profit's
Yeah,
higher in that time.
yeah. It's interesting. We've got a handful of clients that Black Friday is a really big deal for them, and it is all hands on deck.
Mm,
But I love doing the comparison at the end of it. Oh, how was 2023 Black Friday compared to
yeah,
2022 compared to
yeah,
2021, so on and so forth.
yeah,
So no, it has a big impact. And actually, the sooner you plan, yeah, in my experience, the,
yeah.
the the better you do. So no, it's interesting to know that. So you typically plan 6 months in advance. Am I right in saying that?
Well, we try to with
Yeah,
clients bring them in, having conversations around that definitely, and just like thinking about like even budgets in particular. Let's say a client sells, um, I don't know, watches and like jewelry. It's probably not peak time right now for
no,
that. Like it's a good time, but it's not when you should be spending the majority of your budget. So that is something that you would think about for Christmas because it's
you
gifting
think about
related and so
seasonality.
on. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? So I mean, it's everyone knows your budget obviously shouldn't be flat, but I do think if you're thinking about having to deal with constrained budgets, still planning for when is it going to be most important to have a bigger
yeah,
budget.
absolutely. And do you? And that's
Yeah.
obviously dealing with seasonality, so on and so forth, very different for each business. How do you then deal with unexpected changes to that plan then? So if a business is facing a tough time and they've just, what we said we were going
Yeah.
to spend is just not feasible anymore, how do you approach that sort of situation?
Yeah. So we normally will just have a conversation about what the impact of whatever is suggested would be. And then we talk about cutting it as a test. So we had a situation with a client in April, yeah, it was April, where they'd spent too much in
Okay,
Q1 on a variety of things, not just our activity. And as a business, they needed to really pull back. So we said, okay, let's test in May 4 weeks of heavily reduced activity and see the impact of that. And very quickly, about 2 weeks, I think it was, the CFO turned around and said, we've got to put it back
really?
up because we're not getting the leads
Yeah,
in.
but you felt great
So,
though, right?
uh, yeah, it was good. Yeah. But I think it was a really important
Mm,
test because it proved to everyone the benefit of what we were doing. Not just, it wasn't just our activity, actually, it
yeah,
was
of
lots of
course.
marketing they were doing, all sorts of stuff. But obviously, anything performance marketing, it's quite quick to see the results or lack of results
Yeah.
if you
Mm,
pull it back. So, seeing a change like that as a test rather than as a this is how it's going to be forever, I think is quite useful. And having that conversation about it being a
that makes
test.
total sense. I mean, one of the big takeaways from this conversation is it's very, very business dependent. One business is going to
Yeah,
approach a constrained budget to another. One business is going to find tough economic times an opportunity, whereas another business is going to find it quite scary. They might panic, they might shrink their budget. And I
yeah,
think the parting message is you've got to understand your numbers. And your
yeah,
numbers, by that, I mean what happens at the top of the funnel, what happens at the bottom of the funnel, what the impact of each one of
yeah,
those are, historical numbers,
100%.
what happens at certain times of the year, how that affects the business. The more, as a marketing leader, you can understand that, the better you can deal with unexpected situations around budgets and market conditions and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think that's a good parting message. Have you got anything else you'd like to input, Kat, in terms of your experience with sort of shrinking budgets and tough
Um,
market conditions?
I just think people need to try and remember not to panic and that things aren't permanent.
Yes.
So, if someone says, right, your budget is now going to be cut by 50%, don't see that as a forever problem and don't do a knee jerk reaction. Really just try and think about what's the best approach for now. Um, yeah, panic is just the worst thing you can do because you make bad
Yeah.
choices.
No. Wise. And it's it's
Definitely.
it's easy to panic. If you're a marketing director, you're a marketing manager, you've got stakeholders to please, you've got KPIs, targets on
Yeah.
your head. So I've got sympathy for those people in those
Yeah.
positions, especially in conditions like now when their expectations of their role has probably not changed, but their budget's probably gotten smaller. So it's getting even more
Yeah.
difficult. So I think communication around
Yeah.
how things are working, that importance of the data becomes even more important, and communicating that to the stakeholders
Yeah.
in the right way. And you've dropped some really good tips on that today in terms of the different stages of the funnel and whatnot. I think that'll be really useful. So, look, I really appreciate your time, um,
Thanks.
and we'll see you all again soon.
Definitely. Loved it.
Cheers, Kat.